Fear is the greatest tool of anyone who wants to prevent or induce a particular action. Fear does not work on our minds or our intellect, but rather on our passions and our desires. We have been for almost a year now, over a year, been embroiled in this national political debate, and we can see very clearly in political rhetoric how fear is used as a tool for persuasion. We might call it fear-mongering, or whatever we call it. And both sides, all politicians at some level are guilty. Support my position or reject my opponent's position, or this horrible thing's going to happen. Children are going to starve. People are going to die. Schools are going to close. You're going to lose your job. Whether or not these said horrible things can be substantiated, the claim is made to arouse some kind of emotional response. In our own quest for holiness, the devil too uses fear, not necessarily substantiated by fact. Fear to keep us where we are in sin, what we were born into, away from God. Sin, by its definition, is exactly that. It's separated from God, separated from neighbor. And fear is a tool, the greatest tool of the devil, to keep us there, keep us separated. In our sinfulness, fear keeps us from being brought into communion, into one with God, one with our neighbor. Jesus is the God incarnate, the God come down from heaven as one of us. The miracles of God, especially those of Jesus, worked throughout his life, and the rising from the dead. These, which should be the great moments of joy and celebration, great moments for all of us to exult in God's glory, are in our own sinfulness, rather than moments of joy and celebration, moments of fear. The world is afraid of this new order that is brought about by the birth of the Messiah. And from that moment of his birth, plots to kill him. Herod starts with the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem to try to eradicate this threat to his power. And for the rest of his life, Christ is going to be on the run from those seeking to arrest, to kill him. Why? Because he comes to save, to set free, to forgive. Jesus heals the sick, cures the lame, forgives sins, and is cursed, is ultimately arrested, is ultimately crucified. He is called the devil, Beelzebul himself, because people are afraid of what this means. Christ raises people from the dead. We see it today in our gospel reading, 3 times, in fact, in his public life. And then himself rises from the tomb. And even in the garden, he has to tell Mary Magdalene, do not be afraid. Fear blinds us to God's greatness right before us. Fear enables us to refuse or ignore it, even though it's right there. Fear is one of those things that allows us to deny reality, to look at the sky and say, oh, it's not blue, because I can't accept it. I can't live in a reality where that's true. And while that may seem ludicrous, we do it all the time because we're afraid of what accepting the truth might mean in our lives. And we don't get to sit back 2,000 years later and say, oh, those poor uneducated ancients. If Christ came today, we would never say that or do that. Fear is well at work in our lives, in our world today. Fear keeps people from going to confession. Fear keeps people from going to Mass. Fear keeps people from marrying the mother or father of their child. Fear keeps people from living a chaste life. Fear keeps people from telling others about Jesus, about the greatness of his love for all of us. Fear keeps priests and bishops from preaching the difficult teachings because somebody might write a letter and get upset. Fear is a powerful tool. It makes us think, I can't do this. I don't know how. I don't have what I need. Or I'm just afraid, paralyzed. Today is the feast of St. Boniface. It's not just the name of a church down the street. He was an early bishop, born in England, went to Rome and sent by the Holy Father to go evangelize pagans in the hinterlands of Europe, going to Holland and Germany to proclaim the gospel to people that had never heard the gospel. Oftentimes when you see St. Boniface, he's holding an axe, symbolic of his death. Ultimately, he won the martyr's crown as he was chopped up as 52 armed men swarmed upon him in anger, in fear of what this change would mean in their life, the change of turning to Christ and the gospel. But it's also symbolic of his own lack of fear. For very memorable in the life of St. Boniface, as he had gone to Germany, he takes an axe and he cuts down an oak tree. But it wasn't just any tree, it was a tree that had been dedicated to the god Jupiter. This was a sacred tree, a sacred pagan memorial. And he chopped it down and used the wood to build a church dedicated to the true God. He was not afraid of Jupiter. He was not afraid of the pagans. He had fear of the Lord. True and holy fear, which is not the fear we've been talking about, but awe and wonder of the God that created him. And that's where we see what fear can do and how we can overcome it. Today in our second reading, St. Paul to the Galatians. Paul was not just any ordinary man 2,000 years ago. Paul was a very well-educated man. He grew up within the temple culture. He was educated as priests would have been educated in that day. He knew the scriptures. He knew the traditions of the temple. He knew how to read and write Hebrew and Greek. He knew also the culture. He was a very cultured man. He knew the ways of the world. He could have been the greatest of politicians. He was very well connected. And that's what threatened him. Because he had heard all the stories about this Jesus of Nazareth. He had heard about all the miracles. He had heard about all the things he had done and who he claimed to be. And he had heard about all these people who were following him, who were giving their lives in obedience to the way, to the gospel. And this he was afraid of. He was afraid of what this would mean, for it would turn everything he knew and he believed and he saw to be true upside down. And he confesses this in the letter to Galatians today, that you heard of my former way of life, how I persecuted the church beyond measure. In the Acts of the Apostles, we see him. He is standing over as Stephen is stoned to death, and countless other Christians are killed at his command. But, the but is very important. God, who from before he was created in his mother's womb, had set him apart. And despite his sinfulness, despite his inability to see it at the time, did not forget about Paul, did not forget about what his plan for Paul was, and was pleased to reveal the love of Christ to him. And we know the story as he's on his road to Damascus, this great light appears to him. Christ, who is light from light, true God from true God, appears to Paul, shows him his infinite mercy. As Peter, James, and John saw Christ's fullness of glory on the Mount of Transfiguration, Paul receives this great bright light of Christ's love, and in an instant is converted. And he has these scales that come over his eyes, symbolic of his and our own fear, our own brokenness. And he's ordered to go to the priest in Damascus to pray over him, and to ultimately go to confession and to have those scales, that brokenness removed. And to make that act of the will to give himself over to this God who had called him to greatness. No matter what our past, no matter what we've done, no matter how scared we have been, God has a great plan for all of us. Boniface could have easily given up. In fact, his first mission trip to Holland was a complete failure. But he knew that God had more in store for him because he trusted in him. And he went back to Rome and said, Holy Father, I have failed, but please send me somewhere where I can do God's work. And he sent him back to Germany. Paul saw Christ and gave his life to him. He knew about him. He knew all the stories. He knew everything. But then when he saw him, finally was able to peel back the scales, to peel back all that stood between him and God. In our life, we too have to peel back whatever it is that stands between us and God. We have to get rid of the fear, and we have to trust. Fear will always keep us separated from God. Trust will make us one with him. That great image of divine mercy, very apropos during this year of mercy, is Christ revealing his heart, bleeding and yet spreading that healing water out upon the world with the simple message, Jesus, I trust in you. If that is our prayer, not just some kind of empty repetition, but flowing from our hearts, indeed we too can be converted from whatever fear or doubt that we have. And we today and forever can become the great saint that God created us to be.